They say the best way to ruin a man's day is to tell him he doesn't own what he clearly owns, and I can confirm it works better than caffeine. One Tuesday morning, I looked out my kitchen window at the stretch of lawn I had mowed for a decade and found neon orange stakes hammered into the ground like a radioactive picket fence. Half my backyard was suddenly outlined in plastic flags, as if someone had decided Monopoly rules applied to real life. My first thought was that kids had been playing some weird new game. My second thought was worse. This was HOA business. Two men in khakis and polos stretched a measuring tape across my grass. One looked at me the way airport staff look at passengers who ask for free upgrades. "Morning," he said. "Just confirming boundaries for the expansion." He said it like I should bring them lemonade. I sipped my coffee instead because caffeine was the only thing keeping me from suggesting they roll themselves up in the measuring tape. Then came Marlene. HOA president, neighborhood monarch, destroyer of barbecues past. She walked like every sidewalk belonged to her and wore the expression of someone perpetually disappointed with humanity. "Oh good, you're here," she said, as if I'd been late to my own execution. "The board approved an adjustment. We're adding new homes. Turns out this section is common property." She waved her hand across my yard like a magician revealing a trick. Only instead of a rabbit, it was my sanity disappearing. "Since when does a volunteer committee get to rewrite deeds?" I asked. Marlene smiled in that special way people do when they think paperwork makes them invincible. She explained that a survey had confirmed it. The fact that her husband's cousin ran the survey company was a detail she didn't consider relevant. The decision, she told me, was final. Construction was scheduled to begin next month. Not proposed. Not pending. Scheduled. My grass was already a corpse in her eyes. I called the county office. After 3 hours of hold music and transfers, I learned the HOA had filed a correction to the property map. It was under review. Reviews take months. The HOA wasn't waiting. By Friday, bulldozers idled at the curb, gleaming like predators. Watching heavy machinery line up to devour your lawn is like seeing vultures circle while you're still breathing. Neighbors walked by, whispering. Some brought sympathy casseroles. Most were just glad it wasn't their turn under Marlene's boot. Fear of the HOA had become a neighborhood religion, and she was the high priestess. No one wanted to be excommunicated. On Monday, I received the letter. It read, "The association has assumed stewardship of the parcel previously believed to be under your ownership." Stewardship, as though they were adopting an abandoned puppy rather than robbing me in daylight. The letter warned that obstruction would result in fines and legal action. I pinned it to the fridge next to my kids' drawings, a perfect study in absurdity. The bulldozers fired up at 7 a.m. sharp. I stood on my porch while the machines chewed into the grass where my son had once wobbled on training wheels, where my dog had dug craters, where smoke from summer barbecues had once drifted. Marlene hovered nearby, oversized sunglasses hiding whatever soul she had left, nodding like she was inspecting progress on the pyramids. She caught my eye and gave the smallest triumphant smile, the kind of smile that says she'd already won. I smiled back, which unsettled her more than shouting ever could. That night, I dug through the old file cabinet. Deeds, surveys, closing papers, tax receipts, every scrap of paper with my address on it. I spread them across the dining table like a general laying out maps before a campaign. My wife raised an eyebrow.
She didn't ask.
She knew better. I wasn't built to roll over. My grandfather had fought a county over a drainage ditch and won. My father once chained himself to a tree rather than let developers cut it down. Stubbornness was the family heirloom. Losing wasn't part of the script. Still, I knew paperwork wouldn't be enough. Marlene lived in paperwork. She spun red tape like a spider spins silk. She trapped people in it until they gave up. If I wanted to beat her, I had to think bigger, stranger, and yes, biblical. Because I had something Marlene hadn't accounted for, something hidden in plain sight. Just beyond the far row of oak trees at the edge of my property sat a dam. Small, old, mostly forgotten but mine. Built decades ago to divert runoff from the hills, reinforced enough to hold back a surprising amount of water. It was my ace in the hole. As I lay awake that night, Listening to bulldozers idle like snoring beasts in the distance, I imagined what would happen if the dam were to unburden itself. If the water it held were suddenly free to find its own path. It would be poetic, in a way. Biblical even. The HOA wanted to take my yard? Fine. Let them try to build on a floodplain. And for the first time since Marlene had staked her claim, I felt calm. Very calm. Because while she believed she had already won, she hadn't yet realized the board had chosen to play chess against someone willing to move pieces off the board entirely. They thought they owned the land. I owned the water. And water doesn't ask permission. The first sign that the HOA was serious came when they brought in a portable office trailer and parked it squarely at the edge of what used to be my yard. Bright white, company logo on the side, windows tinted like they were hiding state secrets. It was absurd enough to be funny. This wasn't a construction site, it was a siege. Marlene strutted around the trailer like she was inspecting her new palace, barking orders into a walkie-talkie as though the fate of the free world depended on where the porta-potty went. The neighbors gathered in clusters to watch, their whispers carrying across the street like the hum of a hive. Everyone wanted to know if I would crack. I smiled and waved. Nothing unnerves people like confidence you shouldn't logically have. By midweek, the bulldozers had torn up half the yard. Foundation lines were chalked across the dirt like a giant board game. I kept my cool, but each scrape of the machines was a reminder that Marlene was winning, at least for now. She made sure to parade around my property daily, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, pretending she didn't notice me standing on the porch. I pretended I didn't notice the smug set of her shoulders. It was a silent duel, and we both knew it. What she didn't know was that I had begun studying the dam in earnest. Every evening I walked the line of oaks and inspected the old structure. It wasn't impressive at first glance. Poured concrete, patched over the years, nothing anyone would give a second look. But I knew its quirks. My father had shown me the release valve when I was a kid, told me stories about the time it nearly overflowed in a storm, how the pressure built until it roared through the spillway. Standing there again, I could feel the weight of the water pressing behind it, silent, patient, waiting for a reason. The HOA believed they owned the ground. They had no idea the ground carried its own artillery. Still, my plan needed more than brute force. Flooding wasn't something you improvised, like pulling a fire alarm. Timing mattered. Optics mattered. And above all, I needed deniability. If the water happened to flow, it had to look like nature had made the call, not me. So I kept my routine steady. Work, mow what was left of the lawn, wave at the neighbors, drink coffee on the porch. The calmest man in a storm that hadn't hit yet. The next twist arrived sooner than I expected. One morning I stepped outside to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Violation. Unauthorized structures. My crime? The shed I had built 15 years earlier, the one clearly listed in my permit, was suddenly deemed non-conforming. The HOA fined me $500 and gave me 10 days to rectify. The message was clear. They were squeezing me. Marlene wasn't satisfied with stealing the yard. She wanted me humiliated, bankrupted, erased. I laughed so hard my neighbor across the street flinched. If she thought a fine was going to break me, she hadn't been paying attention. By Friday, the construction crew hit their first snag. The soil was softer than expected. Machines sank into ruts, and the foreman looked increasingly exasperated. I caught snippets of his conversations. Extra drainage needed, foundation issues, delays. Marlene's expression tightened. She hated delays. She wanted this victory to be swift and visible, proof of her dominance. Instead, the land itself was resisting her. I didn't need to intervene yet. The ground was already on my side. But I couldn't resist nudging things along. That weekend, under cover of dusk, I took a walk to the dam. My flashlight cut across the mossy concrete, the weeds that clung to its edges. I checked the release valve. Rusty, but functional. I turned it slightly, just enough to hear the water whisper against the metal, then closed it again. The sound stayed with me all night, like a promise. I wasn't ready to unleash it, but knowing I could gave me a calmness no lawyer or surveyor could provide. Monday morning delivered the next escalation. Marlene called a mandatory neighborhood meeting in the community hall. I went, partly for the entertainment value, partly to measure how far she would go. She stood at the podium, all pastel blazer and rigid posture, and announced that the HOA had secured additional funding to expedite the new homes. She framed it as a win for everyone: higher property values, community prestige, even the vague promise of a shared recreational space. She spoke like a politician who believed her own applause. A few neighbors clapped. Most stared at the floor. When she finally asked for questions, I raised my hand. "What's the evacuation plan if there's flooding?" I asked, voice calm, eyes steady. Silence. She stammered about elevated foundations and modern engineering. I just nodded, said nothing more. But the room shifted. People glanced at each other. A seed of doubt had been planted. The real shock came 2 days later. Marlene herself knocked on my door. She didn't come alone. She brought the HOA's lawyer, a sharp-faced man in a suit too expensive for our zip code. They offered me a settlement. If I signed over the disputed land and agreed not to contest future expansions, they'd forgive the fine and give me a generous stipend of $2,000. $2,000 for half my backyard. I almost choked on my coffee. I asked for the offer in writing, smiled, and closed the door without shaking hands. Behind me, my wife whispered, "You're enjoying this too much." She wasn't wrong. That night I stood by the dam again, staring at the still surface of the water. The stars reflected off it, calm and innocent, masking the pressure beneath. The HOA thought they had cornered me with fines and paperwork, but they hadn't realized the board game they were playing sat on a table I could flip whenever I wanted. And soon, very soon, I was going to flip it in a way none of them could anticipate. By the 3rd week, my yard looked less like a home and more like a battlefield. Concrete forms were in place, rebar sticking out like skeletal ribs, and the noise was relentless. The crew worked dawn to dusk, as if Marlene herself had promised bonuses for each nail hammered before sunset. Yet for all their energy, I noticed cracks forming, not in the concrete, but in the operation itself. Workers argued with foremen, deliveries arrived late, and rumors spread about cost overruns. Every delay tightened Marlene's jaw another notch. I took long sips of coffee on my porch and smiled, making sure she saw. Nothing infuriates a tyrant like serenity in the man they're trying to crush. Then came the drone. Yes, a drone. One morning a buzzing sound filled the air, and there it was, hovering over my house like an insect from a dystopian movie. Neighbors gathered to gawk while Marlene stood in the cul-de-sac, remote control in hand, grinning like she had invented surveillance. The HOA had apparently decided I was too unpredictable to watch with just human eyes. The drone swooped low, circled my shed, even paused above my back deck. I waved, then went inside and fetched a baseball bat. Next time it came close, I swung like I was aiming for a home run. Metal cracked, plastic shattered, and the drone dropped like a stunned bird into my flower bed. I left its carcass there for days, a trophy. Marlene filed a complaint about destruction of community property. I filed it in my trash can. But even small victories couldn't distract from the bigger problem. The foundation was finished. Soon walls would rise, and once walls stood, the theft would feel permanent. That night I walked to the dam again. I checked the valve, turned it a hair, and listened as water hissed like it wanted out. I closed it quickly, heart pounding. Timing was everything. Too soon and they'd rebuild. Too late and I'd lose the element of surprise. The pressure behind that concrete was more than physical. It was my leverage, my revenge waiting in the dark. The twist arrived on a Friday afternoon. I came home to find 3 county trucks parked out front. Inspectors in hard hats prowled the site, measuring, photographing, muttering. Apparently, a complaint had been filed about improper drainage management. I didn't need to guess who filed it. Marlene's paranoia had gotten the best of her. She was terrified I'd somehow weaponized the dam. The irony was delicious. Her own suspicion was now slowing her project. The inspectors issued a temporary halt order. Construction froze. Workers packed up their tools. The silence was heavenly. Of course, Marlene didn't blame herself. That evening she stormed across my porch, clipboard in hand, demanding to know if I'd tipped off the county. I leaned against the doorframe, perfectly calm, and said, "Funny you should worry about water. Nature has a way of taking what it's owed." She called me cryptic, dramatic, uncooperative. I called her a trespasser and shut the door. It was the first time I saw genuine fear flicker across her face. She was starting to realize I wasn't bluffing. But fear makes people reckless, and reckless Marlene was more dangerous than smug Marlene. 2 days later, I woke to the sound of shouting. The construction crew had returned despite the halt order. They were pouring concrete at dawn, hoping to finish before inspectors circled back. Trucks blocked the street, lights blazed, engines roared. It was chaos, and neighbors were furious. One man yelled that his driveway was blocked. Another shouted about noise ordinances. For the first time, Marlene wasn't the only target of neighborhood resentment. The crowd turned ugly, and Marlene's voice, usually sharp and commanding, wavered. She was losing control of her flock. I stood at the edge of my porch and raised my voice just enough to carry. "Careful with the foundation," I said. "Wouldn't want a flood to wash it all away." The silence that followed was instant and heavy. Even the workers paused. Marlene tried to laugh it off, calling me melodramatic. But the word had already taken root. Flood. Everyone looked toward the oaks, toward the dam hidden behind them. Suddenly, the project seemed less like progress and more like hubris. No one said it aloud, but I could see it in their faces. Maybe building here wasn't such a great idea after all. That night, I made my choice. I walked to the dam under cover of darkness, flashlight off, moving by memory. I knelt by the valve and placed my hand on the metal wheel. It was cold, slick with condensation. I turned it a quarter inch. Water rushed against the gate, hissing louder than before. Not enough to release, not yet, but enough to test the pressure. I whispered to the darkness, "Not tonight." But soon. The water surged like it had heard me. The next morning, a new twist landed. A letter from the HOA lawyer, hand-delivered. They weren't offering settlements anymore. They were threatening a lawsuit for defamation of community character. Apparently, my flood comment had spread like wildfire, and property values were jeopardized. They demanded a public retraction. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. They were suing me for scaring people with the truth. My wife read the letter and shook her head. "You're enjoying this way too much," she said again. She wasn't wrong. But I wasn't reckless either. I knew lawsuits could drag on for years, bleed me dry. I needed something faster, cleaner, undeniable. Something that would end the fight before it consumed everything. And standing on my porch, watching Marlene bark orders while her workers defied county law, I realized the time was closer than I thought. The dam wasn't just a weapon. It was inevitability, a wall holding back justice that only needed one twist of a wheel to arrive. The lawsuit was supposed to intimidate me. Instead, it emboldened me. Marlene and her lawyer believed they could drown me in paperwork before I drowned them in anything else. They underestimated how much energy I had stored up from watching my lawn pulverized into dust. I filed my response calmly, citing county codes, attaching photos of their illegal construction, and noting every instance of harassment. Bureaucracy was her weapon, but I could wield it too. My counterattack slowed her momentum, but it wasn't enough. The HOA needed a shock, something visible, something undeniable. The shock came in the form of rain. Heavy, relentless, biblical rain. It started on a Wednesday evening, thunder cracking across the hills, sheets of water pounding rooftops. By morning, the soil was soaked, construction trenches filled with muddy pools, and the foundation they'd poured so defiantly sagged at the edges. Workers sloshed in ankle-deep muck, their equipment sinking like toys in a sandbox. Marlene tried to act unfazed, but panic slipped through her voice as she barked at the crew to pump it out, keep working. Nature had already joined my side. All I had to do was nudge. That night, I walked to the dam. The rain had swollen the reservoir until the surface lapped against the spillway. The air smelled of moss and electricity. I crouched by the valve, listening to the roar of pressure behind the concrete. One turn and the water would surge, carving its own path downhill, straight through the heart of the HOA's vanity project. My hand hovered on the wheel. I could almost feel the vibration of power beneath my palm. But I didn't turn it. Not yet. Timing mattered more than impulse. I wanted them to taste fear before I served justice. The next morning, inspectors returned. The storm had triggered runoff alerts, and they weren't pleased to see unapproved construction continuing despite the halt order. They cited violations, fined the contractor, and issued a stop-work directive so stern even the crew looked spooked. Neighbors whispered about potential flooding, how the dam was old and unreliable. Funny how quickly gossip morphs into prophecy. I hadn't opened a single valve, but the story was already writing itself. Fear, once planted, grows faster than any lawn. Marlene's mask began to crack. She went door to door, insisting the dam was perfectly safe, that my comments were exaggerated. But the harder she pushed, the less people believed. Residents started asking questions about emergency plans, about flood insurance, about why the HOA had ignored drainage studies. The community she ruled through fear was beginning to doubt her. And in HOA politics, doubt is poison. I didn't have to convince anyone. I just had to let her unravel. By Friday, she staged a spectacle. A community barbecue, hastily organized, on the very patch of churned mud where houses were supposed to rise. She set up tents, hired a bounce house, even rented a DJ. It was meant to show control, to project confidence. I attended, plate of ribs in hand, nodding politely to neighbors. I watched her hover near the microphone, rehearsing smiles, desperate to appear unshaken. But the ground betrayed her. Rainwater pooled underfoot, children splashed in mud, and the bounce house sagged into a puddle like a sinking ship. When lightning flickered in the distance, people scattered. The party collapsed into chaos, and Marlene's forced grin faltered into a grimace. Symbolism writes itself when you know where to look. That night, I made my move. Not the flood, yet, but something quieter. I opened the valve just enough to release a steady stream. Water spilled down the spillway, carving tiny channels into the hillside, seeping into the construction site below. By dawn, the trenches were deeper, the soil more unstable. It looked like nothing more than storm damage. Nature's hand, not mine. Workers cursed as pumps failed, mudslides thickened, and equipment bogged down. Marlene's empire was literally sinking beneath her feet. The real twist, though, wasn't the water. It was the defection. One of the board members, a man named Jeff who had always nodded along with Marlene like a nervous bobblehead, showed up at my door. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "I can't do this anymore," he said. He confessed the board had known about drainage risks but ignored them. He admitted the survey had been manipulated. He even handed me copies of internal emails, proof of collusion between Marlene and her cousin's firm. "If this blows up, I don't want to go down with her," he said. For the first time, I saw fear not just in Marlene's face, but in her allies. The cracks in her fortress were widening. I thanked him, filed the papers away, and poured him a drink. He left looking lighter, relieved to have shifted his guilt onto someone who could actually use it. I sat at my table, staring at the evidence. This wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was fraud, corruption, negligence. Marlene hadn't just picked a fight with me. She'd picked a fight with gravity, with water, with truth. And those always win in the end. That weekend, the rain returned, harder than before. The reservoir swelled dangerously close to the top of the dam. Neighbors called the county, demanding inspections, evacuation plans. Panic rippled through the streets. Marlene held an emergency meeting, shouting that everything was fine, that rumors were out of control. But her voice cracked, her certainty eroded. People weren't listening anymore. They were listening to the water, to the thunder, to the ground shifting beneath them. I stood in the back of the hall, silent, calm, watching her kingdom collapse. Back home, I stood once more by the dam. The wheel was slick, the metal trembling under the force behind it. My heart pounded, but my mind was clear. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was inevitability. The HOA had stolen my yard, my peace, my patience. They had built arrogance on soft ground, corruption on fragile trust. Now the flood was no longer a question of if, but when. And when it came, no lawsuit, no barbecue, no drone, no clipboard would stand against it.
The storm that broke the stalemate arrived without warning. No forecast, no polite drizzle to ease us in. Just a black wall of clouds swallowing the horizon and a wind that shook window frames like they were toys. By dusk, the sky cracked open, releasing torrents of water that turned streets into rivers. The gutters overflowed, tree branches snapped, and my yard, what was left of it, became a swamp. The reservoir behind the dam rose at a terrifying pace, fed by relentless sheets of rain. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, while thunder rattled the dishes in my cupboards. Marlene's lights blazed across the street, and I could see her silhouette pacing, frantic, a general realizing her army was deserting. The storm was merciless, but it was also opportunity. Timing, at last, had chosen me. At midnight, when the worst of the storm peaked, I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the dam. The oaks bent under the wind, branches thrashing, leaves slapping at my face. The concrete shuddered under the assault of water pressing against it, vibrating like a living thing. The roar was deafening. My hand gripped the valve wheel, slick with rain, and for a moment I hesitated. Releasing it would be irreversible. Once the water was free, there would be no undoing it. But then I remembered Marlene on my porch, smirking behind her sunglasses, declaring my yard common property. I remembered the bulldozers ripping up the grass where my son had taken his first wobbly bike ride. I remembered the drone circling like a mechanical mosquito, the fines, the lawsuit, the arrogance. My hesitation vanished. I twisted the wheel. The sound was like the world exhaling. A low groan, then a sudden violent rush as water burst through the spillway. It roared downhill, carving a new riverbed through mud and roots. Within minutes, it reached the construction site. Foundations cracked, trenches collapsed, and machinery sank into a rising tide of brown froth. The flood swept across the half-built homes, tearing through lumber stacks, flipping pallets, swallowing work like it had never happened. Lights flickered, alarms wailed, and voices rose in panicked shouts. From the ridge above, I watched my stolen land reclaim itself. Neighbors poured from their houses, some in shock, some with cameras. "Flood!" someone screamed. Marlene appeared in the chaos, drenched, shouting orders no one followed. She waded into knee-deep water, yelling for the workers to save the equipment, but the machines were already beyond saving. One excavator tilted, groaned, and toppled with a splash that silenced even her. She froze, helpless, the queen without a kingdom. The very ground had turned traitor, and there was nothing left for her to command. By dawn the rain slowed, but the damage was done. The construction site was unrecognizable, a swamp of broken boards, drowned tools, and churned mud. Half the street was blocked by debris. My yard, what little remained untouched by machinery, was underwater but still mine. The county trucks arrived before breakfast, inspectors in rain gear surveying the wreckage with grim expressions. Neighbors gathered in hushed circles, whispering about lawsuits, liability, insurance nightmares. Not one of them looked at me with anger. If anything, there was quiet relief. Relief that the bully had finally been humbled. Marlene tried to rally. She stormed into the crowd, soaked hair plastered to her face, screaming that the dam had been sabotaged. Her accusations sprayed like the rain, hitting everyone at once. But when asked for proof, she had none. Her board members stood silent, some refusing even to meet her eyes. Jeff, the defector, handed the inspectors his folder of emails. He looked at me once, briefly, and then stepped back. The inspector's questions shifted from me to her. Fraud, negligence, unauthorized construction, it all fell squarely on her shoulders. She sputtered, denied, pointed fingers, but no one believed her anymore. Her power evaporated as quickly as the flood had risen. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift. Not victory, not triumph, something quieter, steadier. Vindication. I hadn't needed to shout or fight or beg. I had only needed patience and the knowledge that arrogance eventually collapses under its own weight. Water had done the rest. In the weeks that followed, the site was abandoned. The trailers hauled away, the mud left to dry into cracked scars. The county launched an investigation. Insurance companies circled like vultures, and lawsuits piled up, but not against me. Against Marlene, the HOA board, the contractor who had gambled on bad soil. My name barely surfaced except as the homeowner who warned everyone about the risk. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved, brought pies, thanked me for standing my ground. I accepted with polite nods. Let them believe what they wanted. The truth was simpler, stranger, and entirely mine. Marlene disappeared. Rumors flew. She moved in with her sister. She was hiding from creditors. She was quietly lawyering up for the inevitable. Her house went dark, mailbox overflowing. The HOA meetings dwindled, then stopped altogether. Without her iron grip, the board fractured. Rules relaxed, fines evaporated, and for the first time in memory, people started enjoying their homes again. Lawns grew a little wilder, barbecues lasted a little later, laughter carried across fences. The neighborhood began to feel like a community, not a regime. And me? I mowed what was left of my yard, repaired the shed, sat on my porch with coffee and quiet satisfaction. The dam still stood, scarred but steady, holding back what it always had. Sometimes I walked there, touched the valve, listened to the low rumble of water waiting behind it. Not as a threat anymore, but as a reminder that patience, like pressure, builds in silence until the right moment arrives. Then it moves, unstoppable. People ask if I regret it, if I worry about what might have happened had the flood been worse, if I lost sleep over the destruction. I tell them the truth. I regret nothing. The HOA took my yard, but I took back my dignity. They tried to bury me in rules, but I buried their arrogance in mud. My revenge wasn't anger or chaos. It was inevitability. And when inevitability comes, it doesn't ask permission. It just flows. So yes, the HOA took my yard. But my revenge? My revenge was biblical.